Hello and welcome to this lecture on Chapter 2. It's on plate tectonics, a unifying theory in geology. So after this lecture, you're gonna understand the evidence for plate tectonics from continental drift, which is a hypothesis presented by Wagner in like 1920s. We're gonna talk about what structures form in the ocean as a result of plate movement. And we're gonna talk about what evidence for plate movement is found in the polarity and alignment of iron in the ocean floor, and what three types of plate boundaries there are and what structures form from the different types of boundaries. We're also going to talk about what seamounts are and guy outs, and we're going to talk about how a hotspot shows plate movement. We're going to talk about how plate tectonics explains the distribution of natural resources and living organisms on planet Earth. So Alfred Wagner proposed continental drift hypothesis in 1912, and he just connected all the different continents into this large supercontinent which he called Pangaea. And this was the first evidence that the plates were moving around because you can fit them together like a puzzle. Why plate tectonics is so important is basically it's the unifying theory of geology, and it ties together all of these seemingly unrelated phenomena, including biogeography, paleobiogeography, why we have certain geological phenomenon that appears to be associated with unrelated or distantly related, I guess, artifacts like the rock formations under each of the continents. We also have the location of certain glacial evidences. Also, we have coal seams in areas that seem to be disconnected, but if you look at it from the sort of continental fit idea, they end up bringing these coal beds very close together. So basically, Wagner and other geologists amassed a large amount of evidence to support this idea that the continents were shifting and moving around, and they called this the continental drift hypothesis. And that's the first evidence for that, like I said earlier, is that there is a close fit between all the continents and the margins of the coast, including mountains and other formations. As Pangaea broke up, the various continents moved around to where they are today, and we can actually track that back with other evidence showing where they were 250 million years ago. So after you put the continents together, then other evidence should show that these rock formations in the continents should line up. And that's in fact what they see. There's similarity of rock sequences in mountain ranges. So you have, if you look right here, there are different ages. So if you look at Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, it's these three things right there. And you look at the Jurassic and Triassic and Permian here, and you'll notice that there are this basalt flow from the Jurassic on these continents. You also note here there's a discontinuity right here, but there is evidence in Australia for a basalt flow, but it's overlaid by what appears to be sandstone. So there's also erosion going on. But if you look, they're all connected with this sequence of rock formations. And so we have marine, non-marine, and glacial rock sequences spanning several 100 million years where they all have the same sequence. And these are derived from the Gondwana continents. Also, if you connect the continents across the Atlantic Ocean, there are mountain ranges that all connect. You have a mountain range down here that connects with the mountain range up here, which connects to a mountain range right here and a mountain range right here. And actually, if you start the seafloor spreading in this area, we actually find that the seafloor spreading, or the divergent plate boundary, which we know is in the Atlantic, actually started in the middle of these very large mountains. These are mountains that were thought to be larger than the Himalayas because it's 2 or 4 continents coming together at one point and creating a huge pileup of rock. And it's a significant mountain range which has been eroding for, think about it, 250 million years, and they're still around. That's the Appalachians. They're still around. They haven't gone away. We also have evidence of continental drift or plate tectonics from glaciers, and the only way that we would see the glacial striations in orientation the way they are is if you lined up the continents in the southern poles, and you'll see the one interesting one here is we have glaciers on Australia and India. Now we do have glaciers in the Himalayas, but we're talking about glacial striations on the subcontinent area right here, which is a tropical region. And then Australia has never been glaciated in recent times because it's very warm. But all of these striations connect. If you follow them back, you see them all right here. If you follow them back in a specific direction, and these go on for many, many miles, they all point to a southern origin if you track back several hundred million years. And we have the fossil evidence, which is, you guys have already seen this, but you have the Mesosaurus, which is a freshwater dinosaur, and you have Glossopteris, which is a seed pod that weighs several kilograms, and it doesn't float. It has to be moved around by dinosaurs, but it crosses all of these different oceans. And then, of course, we have the Lystrosaurus, which is right there, and the Cynognathus, which is right there. And these are land animals that are not, they'd be in desertified areas and they wouldn't be swimming. But yet we find their fossils across the oceans, which suggests these were moving around. And the only problem with all of this evidence is Wagner couldn't provide some mechanism to demonstrate how the continents were moving around. Why did they move the way they did, and why they are continually moving today. So a lot of the geologists basically discounted it, and they still considered catastrophism as the reason for all of the different mountain ranges and everything. So these massive, they thought there was massive upheavals in a distribution and changeover of rocks or whatever, and they called it catastrophism. And things actually got a little more interesting when we were able to go to the sea floor and look at, the continental shelves, the slopes, the rises, the abyssal plains, the ridges, the submarine vents, and then of course the oceanic trenches. And when we look at the structures that you have on the oceanic floor, you have the mid-oceanic ridge, which has lava coming out of it, and it produces a force that it's called a ridge push that pushes this slab in this direction and also in this direction. And then if this happens to subduct under a continental plate, you end up getting a slab pull down here to pull this under faster and ridge push. If you watch the video, they have an explanation. It's like the minute geology video or minute science video. It talks about this idea of not necessarily ridge push, but of slab pull. And they show a chain on a table, and they start that chain tumbling over the table, and it goes faster and faster as the chain gets longer once it gets over the table. And so it increases its speed. But all of these, the only way you can explain why these structures exist is due to the movement of the plates, and how the ocean basins form is due to the movement of these plates. One of the indications that something's going on underneath the seafloor are these submarine hydrothermal vents, which basically they suck up water from the edges because the really superheated water gets spewed out in a plume of chemistry. Basically, it's full of sulfates and sulfides and iron and copper and even gold and silver. There's where a lot of these veins come from. But as the hot water circulates through, it discharges this huge plume, and it's called a black smoker. And this is obviously evidence of something going on underneath the ocean floor. And that evidence leads to where we get these divergent plate boundaries forming. And in one example of plate movement, which is also retained in the ocean floor are these seamounts. So you have things like the seamounts, which are basically underwater volcanoes that never break the surface. And since they never break the surface, they're not eroded by the ocean, so they look like a small or a smaller volcano. Then you have the guyouts, which are these volcanoes that are from the spreading divergent boundary that break the surface, as you can see right here, and then wave action as this volcano moves down because of the ridge push. It's pushing this slab downhill in a sense. They get eroded, like right here, wave action, everything erodes them off, and you have these plateau-like volcanoes that are underneath the water. And you can see this if you go on Google Earth, you can see all this stuff. You go to like where the Hawaiian Islands were in the past and where they've eroded down, you can see the guyouts and seamounts. So actually that's from a hot spot, but it's the same kind of process. As the oceanic floor moves over the top of that hot spot, these same kind of features are developed. The guyouts and the seamounts that form near or these hotspots are called aseismic ridges. They're a little different than obviously the divergent plate boundary, but similar action is going on. More evidence for this movement of the plates is the apparent polar wandering. We call it apparent because it's not really wandering. The only thing that the poles do is they shift polarity, so the north becomes south and south becomes north, but they don't actually wander around. So when the magnetic poles, as I say here, let me get my pen, they say they had wandered. So it indicated that either the magnetic poles had wandered in each continent on its own pole, which is impossible because there are two different, you can't have two poles. That's what they're saying right here. Here's one, here's two. You can't have two different poles because there's only one magnetosphere. And so this occurred in the 1950s when they dropped this magnetic, or not dropped this magnetic, they would look at the iron containing minerals and say how they lined up when they were molten. So if the continents were moved into different positions, as it says right here, the separate poles actually resolve into one if you account for the movement of the different plates. Now, this is about the time where they start saying, you know, maybe Wagner was onto something when he had this continental drift hypothesis. Be aware that Wagner died in 1930. He was on an expedition and he died with one of his colleagues. And so there wasn't really a champion for this idea, but a lot of evidence started stacking up, suggesting that something was really going on, and we're starting to understand that something's going on underneath the Earth. We also saw paleomagnetic reversals, which is basically remnant magnetism in these ancient rocks. So this is old lava rock. You get a lava flow. As you can see in the first slide, or the top of the slide here, you have a alignment to the north. That's the arrows are pointing in the direction of north, right? Just like you do if you have a compass. So they're pointing north whenever this thing erupted, and then later on these are still pointing north because they're solid rock. You get another eruption and they're pointing the other direction. So this shows geologists that the poles are shifting, and it's actually happening at a very regular kind of interval. So this could be 5,000 years or 10,000 years or whatever the regular interval is. As a matter of perspective, I know in the last 5 million years the poles have reversed 13 or 14 times. So it's pretty regular. It's not like this is happening over 10 million years or something. This is happening, you know, every 500,000 or, you know, and it happens not so regular. I mean, it does shift, and the gaps can be anywhere from, you know, 5,000 years to 50,000 years, depending on, we don't really understand why it shifts in the first place. But we do have now a mechanism that if you look at it over a long time period, you get some pretty regular shifting. And what we see when you look at the different kind of reversals is you see that the age, so here's the seafloor is spreading. It's a lot easier to see it actually in the Atlantic, which is over here, this blue line. That's the seafloor spreading in this direction, and it's spreading in this direction. And what it's doing when it spreads is you get a pole reversal, and you can age these things. This is like 200 20 million years old or something like that. That's the oldest part of the ocean. There's another older version, part of the ocean here, but we know that the ocean crust is actually relatively young. And what's interesting is if you look right here, this is 220 million year old crust, and so is this. And this shows you this is the area where the divergent plate boundary began. So we ended up spreading the what is the Appalachians and the mountains in Africa and Europe along the coast there, started spreading about 220 million years ago. And here's what it looks like when you look at the magnetic reversals on the seafloor. If the ship that carries this magnetometer starts at the divergent plate boundary and then looks at the pole reversals, you'll see they have a blue one here, and then it reverses and it becomes gray. I mean, this is just the colors they put in there, and then it reverses again, and they show it with a color yellow. And you can look at it down here. When you look at the positive versus negative, where we are now, this is what's interesting. Here's, if you look at how they're shifting, they shift pretty regularly, right? If you look at them, they're pretty regular in their shifting. We're right here right now, which means we're in the positive side of this as far as where the North Pole is. And when you look at like the reverse of this, this is when the negative response increases. Well, actually, the positive is switching directions is what you're supposed to see. But it's a magnetic profile that shows you that the age of the sea floor, and that it actually is getting older the further you get from that divergent plate boundary. So here we have this overwhelming evidence for all the plates are moving, and we're rapidly getting acceptance for the movement of these plates, and it's in the 1960s. So when we talk about geology, they talk about being the really old science. Most of the present day ideas that we have in science, when we talk about theories and all this kind of stuff, it's very recent. So we talk about biology, we talk about theory of plate tectonics, theory of evolution, all of these things. These are within the last 100 years. This is one of the most interesting times to live. We talk about quantum mechanics. We talk about theories, Einstein, the theory of relativity, which is Einstein started out with Einstein's hypotheses, but this all started within the last 100 years, and it's a very fascinating time. We're learning more now than we ever have in history, and we have more knowledge. And it's just a good time to be alive if you're interested in science or just understanding the way the world works. So in 1970s, early 70s, we start elaborating on this idea of what plate tectonics is and what's the phenomenon behind it. So they're looking at volcanism, they look at seismicity, which is seismic movement, where mountains are built, the climatic changes. We look at the hot spot, the ring of fire, look at animal and plant distributions, so paleobiogeography, that's the kind of stuff that I did, and the distributions of all of the natural resources across the planet. And it starts becoming apparent that the plates are moving, and it's the unifying theory in geology because it explains why all of this stuff is doing what it's doing, why we have all the distributions of the things that I just talked about, and why things are going on the way they are. And so the lithosphere is sort of hypothesized to overlay this asthenosphere, which it doesn't hypothesize. We know this is the case because we can use earthquakes to actually identify where density of layers changes. So we know that there's an asthenosphere and a lithosphere, and that this asthenosphere is sort of plastic. It's like GAC, it's a cornstarch and water, and it's under pressure, but if you release that pressure, it becomes a liquid, which is the magma. And so most of what we talk about in geology, you really only have to understand that it's really talking about heat and pressure, which drives the three different plate boundaries, which then drives the rock cycle and, well, the igneous parts of the rock cycle, and then the weathering and everything else associated with that gives us the other rocks, and then metamorphic rocks is also associated with plate tectonics and where the hot spots and magma chambers are, and then also heat and pressure. And so we know that the interior of the Earth has operated the same way since the Proterozoic era, which is before we have, multicellular life forms, and we can date the rocks, and we know that things are moving around, and we have the three types of plate boundaries that we can. What this slide is showing you is we have convergent plate boundaries. That's where it looks like a front, and there's very interesting when I say it's a front. Remember that it looks like a front that you would have on a weather map. And then you have the divergent, where the arrows are going the other direction. The divergent plate boundaries, that means they're moving apart. And then the transform, where the arrows are sliding past each other, like right there in San Andreas. We now can explain why we have these different kinds of boundaries. We also started explaining what happens when you get a separation of, like the Appalachians and the continental mountains, the coastal mountains that you have in North America, South America, Africa, and Europe. And what you'll see when you first get a divergent plate boundary forming is there's a magma chamber, which causes this part of the crust to become less dense because it's now liquid and it's sort of bubbling up. You get lava coming out, spewing out, which is more dense than the crust that's around it, and starts moving the crust away from this midpoint. Then, because this material right here, this rift valley forms, because the material right here is more dense than the crust, right? Because it has more iron and magnesium in it. And because you're also pushing this crustal material away, you're reducing the pressure right here. And even though the heat is remaining the same, right? The heat remains the same, which is high. This turns into a liquid because the pressure is going to be released, and you reach a point at which the pressure is at the right point for this to become molten. More lava spews out here. You end up spreading it even further, and then eventually you get this narrow sea, inbound or fault-bounded sea, because you have the divergent plate boundary. It's more dense. Seawater then rides lower than the continental crust. It's a pretty similar kind of situation. It fills in the lower areas. It's usually salt water because it's more dense than fresh water. And if it was fresh water, it would just drain into a sea anyway, and eventually would become seawater as this drop below sea level because its material is more dense than the seawater. So you end up with this. More spreading is occurring, more ridge push, and eventually you end up with a wide ocean, or think of the Mediterranean. So we do have examples of this. This would be like the Danakil Depression in Africa, and then you have the Red Sea, which would be this right here, and then you have the continental seaboard, or the continental coastal sort of ocean, that would be similar to the Mediterranean, or even, the Atlantic, but depending on how far you'd say these were spreading apart. One interesting thing is we do have an aborted, this system right here at the very beginning, we have an aborted divergent plate boundary that runs along the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, and that's where the New Madrid Fault is, and that's where we keep having, it's an old fault, but we still have earthquakes forming along that fault. Actually, it produced one of the biggest earthquakes of all time in North America, at least we think, in the 1700s, when the Mississippi River actually changed direction for a short period because the earthquake was so violent. It's pretty interesting. One thing that you'll see, characteristic features of these divergent plate boundaries, is you'll see faulting, and you see dikes and sills and lava flows, all the kind of things you see with volcanism. And you also have a thick sedimentary sequence within the Rift Valley, and that's associated with different material pouring into the Rift Valley, and also you have pillow lavas and certain kind of structures that are underneath that sedimentary sequence. And these are associated with deep sea sediments that show ancient spreading ridges from, you'll find those along the coast of the East Coast, because we get these ancient spreading ridges which started the Atlantic Ocean, but there's evidence of when it started and what it looked like. And here's what I just mentioned just a second ago. We have East Africa, the Danakil Depression, these rift valleys, and then you have the oceanic crust, which is the blue, like the Gulf of Aden, and then you have the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, I'm sorry, and then the Red Sea, which you have showing this Arabian Peninsula, which is getting separated by this divergent, or separated away from Africa with this divergent plate boundary. These are in the initial stages of continental breakup. Eventually there might be an ocean here, or it could be aborted at some point. It's trying to predict the weather of the rock, which is really an appropriate metaphor, and I'll talk about why that is the case. in this slide. So we have what looks like, basically a storm in the rock. It is a current that's moving, causing these rocks to move around. And here we have a convergent boundary. It's an oceanic convergent boundary. So we have a oceanic trench that is forming right here, which is in the forearc. And then as this drops down, I call this the boot effect in my face-to-face. And basically what happens if you've ever, stepped on anything with a boot, right? And the pressure brings down on the boot and you have all of these clay particles that line up under your boot, which causes a force to push your boot up. But the minute you try to lift your foot, all of these clay particles sort of disengage and all of the water, all of the H2O that's around here starts rushing in and it causes a suction, a force in the opposite direction. And when it does that, this is all becomes liquid under your boot. Well, the same thing happens right here. As this plate moves down, the pressure is going down, the heat is still high, stays the same, and this rock becomes liquid. That's basically why it becomes liquid, and then it starts moving up. As it becomes less dense, it starts moving up through. What's interesting is as this moves up through the rock over many millions of years, you're left with less dense, higher silicate containing rock, which ends up being the volcanoes. The actual sort of oceanic crust type of high magnesium, high iron material falls out earlier, and that's many, could be miles underneath the volcano. And so you end up with this very interesting situation where you have a volcanic arc, that would be the Aleutian Islands or something like that. Here we have Japan, they show up Japan, but we have the Aleutian Islands up in Alaska as well. Then, of course, you have the oceanic continental boundary, which is where you have a oceanic plate that's sliding underneath a less dense continental plate right here. Same kind of stuff. You get partial melting. You get the pressure is getting reduced. Heat is still high, and you get melting, and then you get these big igneous chambers moving through the rock. It also can be eroded down. These are big enough where this will be uplift because you have less dense, but it also is getting eroded down, right? All this is eroding off, and you're actually exposing some of these, some of this material, and that's what a volcano is. Eventually, you'll get a volcanic tube that runs all the way through, and you'll get, eruptions, etc. Then, of course, you have the continental boundary, which occurred with the Appalachians and then those coastal mountains before the divergent boundary, and those mountains, which were the Appalachians and the other ones when they were connected, were thought to be taller than the Himalayas. But here you have, which started out as an oceanic plate boundary because it would be India, that then is getting crushed into the Eurasian plate, and you end up getting, well, sort of like a train wreck. There's a car here, it'd get run over, but if there are two trains running into each other, all that happens is you get these huge thrust zones that then force the mountains up into the air. So these are two continents that are converging and creating very large mountains. The Alps are also a part of this. So neither plate subducts, and you end up getting these very jagged, tall mountains formed. You get sutures and other things that indicate of what's going on. And you also get a lot of faulting, but there's no volcanism, at least not a lot. So here we have transform boundaries, which are associated with the divergent plate boundaries, where you get an offset where the lava is coming out and forcing those plates apart. You get offset divergent ridges, and they actually will cross each other, and as they do, they grind against each other, and these are called transform faults. They transform the rock based upon the pressure and the temperature that's associated with them. San Andreas fault, which is actually the plate, the North American plate running across the Pacific plate, although this material here that is the Pacific plate is actually really a more of a continental type of structure because of its density. That has a lot to do with the type of material that's being produced by these divergent zones down here and the material that's there, but that's running across each other. also obviously producing a lot of earthquakes. I don't know if it's obvious, but that's where a lot of those earthquakes. We're worried about significant earthquakes in a highly populated zone, which would be along the San Andreas Fault. Then we have these hot spots, which are associated with volcanism, and they're stationary. They don't move, but the plates move over the top of them, which means as evidence for more plate tectonics, or the shifting of these plates, are these long seamounts, like I said, the seamounts and these big chains or rises that occur due to the volcanism. So we have Hawaii right here, but the plate is moving this direction. At one point, the plate was moving basically north. Now it's moving northwest. So it's shifted somewhat, but and that has to do with how much magma comes out at specific divergent plate boundaries, or lava. It's not magma if it's coming out of the ground. But one interesting thing about the Hawaiian Islands is we can actually measure the rate of plate movement, and I don't think I have this in the lab. I used to do this with our students, where you measure, how old this Maui is, and then you measure the top of where Hawaii. Obviously, this is more recent than 0.7 to present, because this is the most recent, so it would be present. So you have to look at the elevational gradient here, but you look at the distance, and you can determine how fast the plates are moving based upon how far apart they are, how far apart the islands are, because once this moves away from the hot spot right here, the island is no longer growing and it just erodes away. So you can measure, you get an average of distance between all these islands. You can get an average rate of movement for that plate. And here's the big idea. So we have convection cells, just like we do when you get a thunderstorm moving through Michigan underneath the lithosphere. They're very large. I mean, they go down hundreds of miles. And they move very slowly. So you get these convection currents. So this is warmer material that comes up to the ocean floor surface. It gets spewed out as lava, and then this pushes this plate down underneath the continental plate, and as it cools, it becomes more dense and it starts falling down. Now, of course, it melts a little bit. Eventually, it gets near the outer core and it'll melt quite a lot. Now, most of this is solid. You got to remember that. It's moving like GAC. This takes a very long time, millions of years, in order to move around down in the mantle convection cell. And then it'll come back out. Similar material. Obviously, it changes somewhat because the chemistry is a little different. Here we have, down at the bottom here, we have a plate that's dipping down, and they have it going all the way down to the inner core before it starts coming back up. Now, it's solid until it gets near the surface, where the pressure, because of the pressure, the pressure goes down and the heat stays the same. I always say it's high, but it stays the same, and which causes this to melt, and which then reduces the pressure because you have more lava coming out as that density changes. But this is basically a storm in the rock. That's what it is. It's a convection cell. It's just a very slow storm, but it's very similar to what you would expect if you were looking at thunder cells. And it's driven primarily by gravity. Convection is the movement of the material due to density factors, but gravity is primarily a component of that density, right? And so gravity drives the mechanism in the sense that it pulls. So we have this slab pull that you heard me talk about before. As the slab goes deeper and deeper into the asthenosphere, it starts pulling the oceanic crust behind it. And it actually, if you watch the video on the minute science or whatever they call that, it moves faster than the upper mantle on which it's on, and the convection current that's the cell that's underneath, because of this gravitational pull. And then, of course, the ridge push, as you build up a higher ridge here, it's just like you getting on a sled and sledding downhill. It's going to push the slab in front of it, which then increases the rate as well. It's ridge, push, slab, pull. And then we have the distribution of natural resources that corresponds to areas where you have these old, not just subduction zones and divergent plate boundaries, but also ancient seabeds, shallow seabeds, but you have the fumaroles and all, and the black smokers, things like that, and so you get deposits of copper, iron, lead, zinc, gold, silver, etc. The reason you get them is because the solubility of these different precious metals goes up if you heat that water up, and it goes up dramatically if you put it under pressure. Same reason that you make hard candy, you have to boil the water or at least heat it up enough so that that sugar goes into solution, and then the minute it cools down, it starts solidifying or precipitating. The same thing happens with these mineral deposits. And here's the Bingham copper mine, which is the biggest open pit mine in the world, and they've been mining this for a very long time, and it's still producing copper and gold and silver. And then, of course, petroleum that's associated with ancient seas. The Middle East is a good example of that, where you have these broad marine sort of coral reefs or shelves that is near the equator. So there's a huge production of marine organisms, which then, of course, die over many millions of years and settle to the bottom. These organics then get compressed and they turn into oil or petroleum. And last, and we're also going to talk about this at the end of the class, we talk about evolution, is plate tectonics and organic evolution are described by, or at least explained by, some of the plate tectonics, which means we can predict where organisms will occupy some biotic zone, and it's controlled primarily by the climate of that zone and the geographic barriers or mountains. We get an elevational effect where you get an elevational gradient on the type of species. So if you go all the way to the top of the Rocky Mountains, you're actually in the tundra, and you're going to find the same species there that you would find up in Alaska, which I do research. I have done research in both places, and I can tell you that's exactly what you find. You find plants that are connected to Mexico, because during glacial events you get these tundra or these really cold zones moving further down in elevation, and they go all the way south into Mexico. It's high elevation, but you still find some of those things. So in summary, we have the puzzle or continental fit showing where the continents once were connected, and it's one of the best evidences we have for plate movement. And then we have the distribution of rock layers is the same across multiple continents. We have continental drift explains why fossils of the same land animals are found on separate continents. We also have seafloor structures are the result of plate tectonics, which is when I talked about the seamounts and the guyouts. And then information of the Earth's magnetic pole shifts trapped in the rocks are evidence that the plates are moving. We also date the oceanic floor due to those shifts in polarity. We also can drill down in the oceans. That's also in the book, where you can look at the different types of sedimentary rock that forms over a long period of time, and you find more layers near the edges or on the coastal zones, because that's the oldest part of the oceanic plate, and it's built up sediment over time. And then, of course, we can look at the movement plates are the results of convection and gravity, and that's just like a storm in the rock. And then the distribution of natural resources and animals is the result of tectonic processes. We know where things are based upon where the mountains are and how certain barriers have appeared for certain animals. That's why the marsupials are found in Australia, because Australia was cut off from the rest of the world before the mammals evolved and pretty much outcompeted most of the marsupials. We still have some. For example, we have the possum, but it's just very good. It fits a good niche, and it's just very good at what it does. Thank you.